Hey guys, tonight we slip into your heavy wool cloak, lean into a biting Nordic wind, and trek across an uneven path of lichen and frost toward a hillside dotted with thick-coated sheep. The sky is a sagging sheet of pewter. Your boots sink into damp turf, and each exhale ghosts into the air like steam from a dragon's nose. In your hand, a curved stick polished smooth by use. Behind you, a pouch filled not with coins or snacks, but bones, knots, and runes. Ahead? A long day of counting, not with a calculator, but with centuries-old tricks passed from wrinkled shepherd to bright-eyed boy. And just so you know, you probably wouldn't survive this. No central heating, no weather apps, and definitely no Excel spreadsheets. But the sheep? They still need counting. And messing that up means going hungry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the damp mist, your senses sharp in a world where counting sheep isn't some bedtime fantasy but a daily necessity. And here's the thing, when your entire community's survival hinges on how well you track livestock, you don't just count, you really count. Forget about abacuses or parchment, this is early medieval Scandinavia. We're talking fjords, salted fish, and longboats, not lecture halls and numbered spreadsheets. You count in your head. On your fingers. In your bones. Quite literally. Because when you're responsible for keeping track of who owns how many sheep, or cows, or barrels of mead, you need a system that doesn't blow away with the next snowstorm. The Viking world wasn't a numeric vacuum. Long before the printing press or widespread literacy, they had systems. Rhythms. Tactile methods of tracking everything from sheep and fish to deaths and marriages. But it all starts with this scene, you, standing on a wet hillside, surrounded by sheep who refuse to stand still, mumbling numbers that don't sound much like 1, 2, 3. Instead, you're murmuring oddities like ein, tain, tethera, methera, and no, those aren't ancient Nordic spells or toddler babble. Those are counting words. Real ones. Rooted in Old Norse, preserved in dialects across England, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland. Words that sound like they've been shaped by wool in the throat and snow in the lungs. Why? Because Vikings didn't just count, they chanted their math. They sang it. Made it rhyme, made it rhythm, because when you're alone on a hillside, your breath fogging up the sky and your fingers freezing off, a rhythm helps. So you hum it under your breath. Yan, tan, tethera, methera, pimp. Yes, pimp meant 5. And no, you're not allowed to giggle yet, we're working here. Now imagine you're the head of your household, someone with land to till, mouths to feed, and livestock to track. You don't have a ledger. You don't even have paper. What you do have are generations of oral tradition, sharpened by necessity. Because in the Viking world, numbers meant something real. You weren't memorizing for math class, you were counting the difference between winter meals and starvation. One wrong count of the sheep meant a missing you. A missing you meant no milk. No milk meant no butter, no cheese, no trade. It was a domino line made of hooves and hunger. So how did it work? You'd start early. Kids learn counting not in school but on the field. A boy might be tasked with tracking how many lambs survived a snowstorm. A girl might be helping her mother track food portions for the winter, each a fraction of some remembered whole. Over time, the sounds of numbers became embedded in the tongue, not the eye. Even the way they organized their world was mathematical. The Norse calendar broke the year into 2 seasons, summer and winter. No spring or autumn. Just the season of doing and the season of surviving. You marked time by moons, solstices, and things like the 3rd week after haymaking. Precision by rhythm. Order by experience. And it wasn't just sheep. The Viking mindset was built around grouping. You'd count in clusters. 20 was a big deal, probably because fingers and toes add up to 20 if you're lucky enough to keep them all through a Norse winter. That's why we'll see this idea of base 20 pop up again and again. And let's talk about that weather. Have you ever tried writing with ink in a snowstorm? Didn't think so. Writing was for rituals and records. Numbers needed to be quick, durable, and repeatable. And repeatable meant sayable. That's why these counting chants stuck. They were waterproof, windproof, and memory-proof. You had to keep things simple, too. Maybe you'd use a stick and carve notches into it as you counted. Or maybe you'd just pick up a pebble for every 5 sheep and hold them in your pouch. There's even evidence that bones were used, not as spooky fortune-telling devices, but as counting aids. Smooth sheep bones, polished by handling, could become crude abacuses of the field. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. In some remote parts of northern England and Wales, areas once touched by Viking trade and settlement, those strange counting words are still used today, by shepherds. Seriously. There's footage out there of old men counting sheep with the same yen, tan, tethera rhythms their ancestors used, and you half expect Odin himself to nod in approval. Historians still argue whether the widespread survival of this oddball counting language is due to Viking roots or just good old-fashioned sheep stubbornness. Either way, it's one of those delightful blurred edges of history that refuses to fade. Now, picture this: you're sitting in your longhouse, the fire crackling low. Your hands ache from a day of trudging after wayward wool. You sip something strong and probably fermented, and across the table your eldest is muttering numbers, pointing at pebbles laid out in a row. You correct him once: "That's not 10, that's 15, and he rolls his eyes. He'll learn. The same way you did. The same way your grandfather did, with a slap on the back and a cold walk up a windy hill. Because counting sheep? It's not just a phrase. Not here. Not now. Not when every hoofprint matters. And tomorrow? You'll rise again. You'll count again. You'll mutter those rhythmic numbers into the wind. And you'll pray the wolves don't mess up your math. You wake to the sound of bleeding. It's still dark outside, because of course it is. In this part of the world, light is a limited resource, like warmth or grain. Your joints ache from sleeping on straw, your hands still smell faintly of lanolin, and the air inside the longhouse is thick with smoke and damp wool. But outside, the flock is stirring. And so must you. This morning, you're not just a shepherd. You're a mathematician with mud on your boots. You step out, boots crunching on frost-hardened earth, and begin to count. Not just 1, 2, 3 like some Sunday school rhyme. No, this is finger work. Toe work. Bone work. You've got 10 fingers, sure, but that's only the beginning. The Vikings, like many early societies, used body counting, a physical way of keeping track when numbers existed more in your muscles than your mind. You start with your thumb, index, middle finger. Keep going across your hand. Then flip the hand over, each knuckle becomes a placeholder. Use the creases, the dips, the in-between places. Hands weren't just for swinging axes or holding tankards. They were counting charts. One quirky method? Touchpoint systems. In parts of the Viking world, children were taught to touch each finger joint in a specific sequence, creating a sort of bodily abacus. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, especially if you were knee-deep in snow, balancing on a rock, with no writing tools and a brain full of worries. Of course, fingers only take you so far. That's where bones come in. Imagine this: you've collected a set of polished sheep ankle bones. They're smooth, satisfying to hold, and each represents a number. You pocket 5 to start your day. Each time a group of sheep passes you by, you shift one from one pouch to another. Tactile accounting. And here's where it gets genuinely weird, in a cozy way. You might find a shepherd with one pouch for in, one for out. A third for unsure sheep. Yes, the liminal ones. The sheep that may or may not belong to you. This wasn't just math, it was fuzzy ethics and guesswork wrapped in fleece. Still, let's not romanticize it too much. Because as useful as bones and fingers are, they had limits. And that's where the Vikings got inventive. Enter the tally stick. Take a flat strip of wood, maybe birch, maybe ash, and mark it with deep grooves. one for every sheep. You might notch diagonally for groups of 5, crosswise for 10. Sometimes, you'd snap the stick in half lengthwise, one half for you, one for the buyer or owner. This split stick system was pretty clever. If the two halves didn't match later, someone was cheating. And no, this wasn't some backwater trick. This exact method was used well into the 1800s in parts of Europe. Even the English Exchequer, the financial authority of the crown, used tally sticks for centuries to record taxes. You could say the Vikings were just ahead of the bureaucratic curve. Now let's mix in some Norse practicality. Imagine you're tracking sheep across multiple days. How do you record that? You might use a knotted cord, a simple string with knots tied at intervals. Each knot equals a sheep, or a group of them. You could roll it up, stuff it into your pouch, and pull it out later to double-check your counts. But you had to be careful. One slip, one tug of the wrong knot, and your accounting system was toast. It's like deleting a spreadsheet column with your elbow. A tragic, woolly accident. Historians still argue whether these systems, bones, tally sticks, finger joints, were used together or if they evolved over time. Some think shepherds combined all three for backup. Others say different regions had fiercely loyal methods, like families arguing over the right way to make tea. What's certain? Counting was always embodied. You didn't learn it sitting at a desk. You learned it while walking, while working, while watching. Numbers weren't symbols. They were sheep. They were lives. And then there's the language again. Counting words like yen, tan, tethera weren't just for fun. They were practical. They had a rhythm that helped you not lose track. Try counting to 20 sheep when your hands are full and a storm's blowing sideways. Try it without a system that sticks in your head like a folk song. These counting chants were a shepherd's version of a mantra. They varied, too. From valley to valley, island to island, the exact words changed. One shepherd might say yen, tan, tethera, while another went ein, tain, et era, but the pattern stayed. The rhythm held. Even into the modern era, researchers found pockets of older farmers still using these old counting words, not just out of nostalgia, but because they worked. There's even a record of children's games in the 20th century still using Viking-rooted number chants to pick players. Ina, Mina, Mina, Mo. Sound familiar? You start to realize the depth of it. The intimacy of it. These weren't just numbers. These were heirlooms. Each count passed from palm to palm, from mouth to ear. They weren't scribbled down. They were lived. Imagine the conversations. How many sheep did old Einar have last season? 2010 and 5, I reckon. 2010? 30. And no one blinked. But here's your mainstream historical fact to toss in your mental pouch. Viking Age Norse actually had a formal numbering system. Archaeological finds, like runic inscriptions and trade documents, show numerals for counting and marking. They weren't abstract. The Norse had names for large numbers. They weren't afraid of counting high, they just preferred doing it with whatever worked best at the time. Still, fingers had their limits. At some point, you had to trust your tools, your chants, or your kin. Because out here, where the fog rolls in fast and sheep vanish behind boulders, you can't just say, oops, I think I missed one. That's dinner you missed. Or a trade. Or worse, someone else's sheep. You glance down at your palm. 6 pebbles. 1 missing. Is it a miscount, or did you wander off? You call out. Oblique answers. And you count again. You squat on a grassy rise, arms resting on your knees, and watch the sheep graze like drifting clouds on the hillside. Their wool is thick, almost comically so, giving them the look of fat ghosts rolling over the earth. You narrow your eyes and begin again. Not with 1, 2, 3, but with ein, twe, tethera, methera, pimp. See, this is where it gets really interesting. The Vikings, and their cultural descendants in places like Iceland and the Faroe Islands, had a sheep counting system that wasn't based on 10. Not really. It was based on 20. What scholars call a vigesimal system. Base 20 math. Accounting logic built not on fingers alone, but fingers and toes combined. Which, honestly, makes you think, who decided 10 should be the universal cutoff anyway? Maybe it's just a toe-averse mainland thing. So let's take a closer look at this quirky system. In Old Norse and the dialects that evolved from it, shepherds didn't just say 21, 22. No, they grouped numbers in chunks of 20. You'd count up to 20, then start again. The phrase for 21 might be something like 1 and 20, or even more colorfully, I know a score. A score being 20. Sound familiar? That's because it made its way into English. Think, 407 years ago. Yes, that's Viking math in your patriotic speech. And if you're wondering how that might sound in real life, well, here you go. Icelandic Shepherd Logic 101. Ein, tver, fjor, fim. You count to 20 like usual. But then, for 21, you don't say a new word. You say, ein og tatugu, literally 1 and 20. And so on. By the time you reach 40, it's not 4 tens. It's tver tiger, 2 20s. But remember, you're not sitting at a desk solving equations. You're up to your knees in wind and dung. So, while this sounds neat and clean now, the reality was a lot messier. You had to track not just sheep, but sheep movements. Ownership. Births. Deaths. The vigesimal system helped chunk data into easier-to-grasp blocks. 20 was a manageable bundle. A bundle you could picture, hold, even wrangle. And let's be clear, it wasn't just a Viking thing. The Celts did it. The French still do it. 429 literally means 4 20s and 19. Chefs kiss their fingers at that logic. What makes the Norse special is how they applied this concept practically. When you counted sheep, you often did so in groups. 20 here, 20 there. Every score was a mental tally. Finish a score, move a pebble. Or slide a bead. Or mark a stick. Quirky tidbit incoming, in the Faroes, shepherds on shared pastures still group sheep into 20s. It's part of a long-standing land use agreement called the Seerhald, and every shepherd contributes to the communal herd based on their property rights, counted in groups of 20 sheep. You can't make this stuff up. Now, step back for a second and think like a Viking. You're managing a flock on a mountain slope. It's foggy. The sheep won't stop moving. You're using base 20 math while muttering Old Norse chants and flicking smooth counting bones in your palm like ancient fidget toys. It's a lot. So, naturally, the system had to be adaptable. Here's how a typical count might unfold. You start muttering, ein, twe, tethera, methera, pimp. You hit 10, dick. Then 11 is ein a dick, literally 1 on 10. 12, twe a dick. 15, pimp a dick. 20, score. Then it resets. I know or score, twe or score. It's like a melody. A chant. One designed to stick. This rhythm allowed shepherds to count large flocks without losing their place. Each score marked a checkpoint. Every 20 sheep was a breath, a pause, a marker in the mist. But what about the skeptics? Historians still argue whether this was just linguistic flourish or a full-blown number system. Some say it was just a memory trick, a song to keep track. Others insist it represents a sophisticated cognitive strategy, breaking large numbers into digestible, trackable parts. Like Viking modular math. And what about writing it down? Rare. Very rare. Counting sheep was oral. It was chanted, whispered, muttered, felt. There was no Viking accounting office where shepherds filed their flock totals. You carried the math in your mouth, your hand, and your muscle memory. Still, when things got serious, like during communal sheep gatherings or taxation, more formal systems kicked in. That's when scribes or priests might step in with runesticks or tally rods. But day to day, you handled it yourself. let's set the scene again. You're halfway through counting. You've muttered your way up to tethera score. That's 23 sheep, if you're wondering. You glance behind you and spot another group cresting the ridge. You mutter a curse under your breath, PG-rated, of course, and start a new score. You shift a bone to the other pouch. 1 score down. You press your thumb to your index knuckle. That's 1 block logged. And then, out of nowhere, a sheep bolts. Just, poof, gone. Vanished behind a boulder. You sigh. If you chase it, you might lose track of the others. If you don't, you might lose a sheep. Welcome to Viking calculus. Eventually, you get the flock back together. Your chant picks up where you left off. The fog clears a little. You hear another shepherd in the distance doing the same, his counting words echo off the stones like some shared language of wool and time. And as night falls, and the sheep bed down, you walk the ridge one last time, pebble pouch heavy, muttering softly to yourself. I know our score, tway or score. You nod. It adds up. For now. The sheep are asleep now, or close enough. Bellies full, legs tucked, eyes half-lidded like furry monks deep in meditation. You sit just uphill from them, wrapped in a woolen cloak that smells faintly of smoke and last week's rain. And as the wind hums its low, familiar tune across the moor, your mind drifts from counting to keeping. Because counting sheep is one thing. But recording the count? That's where the magic, and the mess, begins. You reach into your side pouch and pull out a worn, notched stick. It's not pretty, just a flat splinter of birch, darkened with time, cut with deliberate grooves. This is your tally stick. Your ledger. Your lifeline. See, in a world without calculators or cloud storage, this thing is your archive. Every notch is a sheep. Every grouping of notches is a score. And each time the flock changes, 1 lamb born, 1 old you lost to a fall, you update your little wooden friend. No ink required. Just a blade, a steady hand, and a good memory. The tally stick wasn't unique to the Vikings, of course. Cultures across Europe, from the Normans to the Scots, used them. But what makes the Norse version notable is their split stick method. You cut a stick down the middle lengthwise, creating 2 matching halves. 1 went to the herder. 1 to the owner. Like a wooden handshake. The notches had to line up exactly, if they didn't, someone had lied. There was no easy way to forge a match unless you had the original. In a world of barter and betrayal, it was a system built on symmetry and sharp edges. And no, it wasn't just for sheep. You used the same method for tracking hay, grain, even favors owed. You could walk into a village with a stick half as long as your arm and say, John owes me 10 lambs and a jar of honey. And John, if he knew what was good for him, would have the matching half tucked somewhere safe, likely with the same notches. Now here's a fringe tidbit for your fireside memory box. Some of these tally sticks were found centuries later, buried in bogs or stashed in the walls of collapsed longhouses, still legible. One even bore a notch so deep that scholars think it marked either a very large debt, or someone just got really carried away with the knife. But sticks aren't your only tool. You also carry a sheep stone, a smooth river pebble marked with charcoal lines. 3 dots? That's 3 ewes due to give birth. A single slash? That's the ram with a limp. You'd refresh the marks with ash or berry juice every few days. The stone fit perfectly in your palm. It wasn't permanent, but it didn't have to be. It was memory made visible, as portable as a thought. When winter came, and oh, it came, you stored these pebbles in a small wooden box lined with wool scraps, like some sacred reliquary of accounting. You'd sit by the hearth, going over them with your fingertips like a priest fingering prayer beads, muttering, this one was for the black-faced ewe, this one for that lamb who keeps wandering. Of course, not everything was so personal. In larger communities, they had sheep books, handwritten records maintained by village leaders or monks. These books, filled with stylized runes and tight, scratchy script, were the closest thing to Excel spreadsheets the Norse had. They included not just numbers but lineage. Which sheep came from which ewe? which shepherd was responsible for which paddock. And yes, occasionally, who borrowed a sheep and mysteriously forgot to return it. Historians still argue whether these sheep books were common in rural areas or mostly reserved for monasteries and manors. Some claim every serious farm had one. Others say only the elite bothered. It's one of those debates you can imagine scholars having over watery coffee in cold archives. But what's clear is this: someone was tracking the sheep beyond just muttered chants and bark notches. And then there were tags. Not the plastic ear tags of today, no. We're talking rudimentary markers, dyed wool strings tied to ears or horns. Red for one family, blue for another. A twist of both? A shared sheep, maybe. Or one that had changed hands. Like sheep mood rings, but more logistical. Now, let's do something modern for a moment. Picture yourself in a spreadsheet. You've got rows and columns. Names, ages, health notes, who was traded where. That's exactly what some Viking shepherds did, with their brains. Their memory palaces were the moors themselves. You didn't need parchment when you had pathways. That bend in the creek? That's where Thorvald lost 2 lambs. That jagged rock? That's where Freya's you always stops to scratch. It was geography as database. You probably won't survive this system if you're used to swiping on glass and hearing pings. But for them, it was second nature. And here's a light joke: imagine a Viking accountant trying to audit a flock. Sir, we found 17 sheep and 1 very smug goat. That goat's emotional support. He doesn't count. Still eats like 3. Noted. The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. They weren't just counting. They were curating. These sheep were bloodlines, economy, and reputation. A well-maintained tally wasn't just proof of ownership, it was proof of competence. No one trusted a shepherd who shrugged and said, maybe 30? Give or take? So the sticks, the stones, the dyed tags, they were more than tools. They were insurance. Against hunger. Against accusation. Against forgetfulness. And sometimes, they were even art. Some tally sticks were carved with flourishes, swirls, animal heads, runes that meant good luck or safe grazing. One stick, found in a Swedish dig site, had a snake pattern running along its edge, possibly the mark of a particularly meticulous herder. Or maybe just someone with a lot of time and a sharp knife. You lean back now, the stars wheeling slowly overhead. The sheep are quiet. Your pouch holds the correct number of pebbles. The tally stick rests beside you, its grooves still fresh from this morning. You run your thumb along its surface. 1 for each sheep. Each sheep a life. Each life a number. Each number a promise. The sky's turning that strange shade of ash blue now, the kind that blurs the line between night and the first smudge of morning. You've barely slept, but that's normal. Sleep doesn't always come easy when you're dreaming in numbers. Because tonight, it's not just about counting sheep, it's about tracking who owns them. And in Viking society, that answer could be anything but simple. Out here on the windswept slope, it might look like all the sheep belong to you. But that's rarely the case. You're likely a herdinger, a hired hand, watching over a flock that belongs to multiple families, each with their own expectations, and their own drama. Every 20 sheep might represent a different household, or a different agreement, or an outstanding favor from 3 harvests ago. Welcome to Viking communal grazing. See, land ownership in Norse societies was often collective. In regions like Iceland and the Faroe Islands, entire communities shared pastures, sometimes rotating flocks between summer and winter grazing lands. But even with communal land, the sheep were individually owned. So shepherds had to know, without fail, which sheep belonged to whom. Miss one detail, and you could spark a feud that would last generations, or at least until the next Althing court session. This was where notching came into play. Yes, you heard that right. They cut tiny, coded notches into the edges of sheep's ears. Think of it as livestock QR codes, minus the lasers. Each family had its own unique pattern, 1 upward nick on the left ear, 2 downward slashes on the right, maybe a triangle or a V shape. It was a whole visual language built into wool and cartilage. So imagine you're walking through your flock. The wind's howling, your fingers are numb, but you're squinting at ears. That notch? Bjorn's. The double V? That's Gudrun's troublemaker. You commit these codes to memory. They become instinctual. One glance, and you know who owes what, who gets which lamb, who's going to grumble at the next village meeting. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, sheep would get into fights or scrape their ears on sharp rocks, accidentally modifying their notches. This led to the occasional identity crisis. One sheep might suddenly look like it belonged to 3 different people. You'd have to play detective, rely on behavior, markings, maybe even voice recognition. Yes, some shepherds could recognize their sheep by voice. A baa is not just a baa when you've been listening to them for years. To manage all this, Norse communities used a legal and social system called the afretter, a sort of collective grazing agreement and roundup event. Picture it, once or twice a year, every shepherd in the area brings their flock down from the highlands to a central sorting fold. Chaos ensues. Hundreds of sheep, all bleating at once, packed like woolly bumper cars. You wade into the mix, ear notch guide in hand, calling out patterns like a livestock bingo announcer. Double notch, right ear. That's Eric's. Someone hollers back, no. Mine's got the same notch but a blue tag, check the rump. It's absurd and exhausting, but also deeply communal. These roundups were events, part labor, part festival. There'd be stew, ale, maybe a skald reciting something epic about sheep heroics no one really asked for. Now here's a mainstream historical fact for your toolbox. Iceland's Retir, the autumn sheep roundup tradition, still happens today. It's changed a bit, of course. More neon vests, fewer ear notches, and probably more drone footage. But the bones of it are the same. Gather the flocks, sort them by ownership, and send them home. It's a living ritual that connects modern Icelanders directly to their Viking ancestors. But back in your time, there's still the paperwork, or rather, the word work. All the ownership agreements. Verbal contracts. You shook hands. You spoke your claim aloud in front of witnesses. In some places, you might have used rune sticks or wax tablets to mark it down, but mostly, it lived in memory. Oral law was powerful in Norse culture. Say something at the thing, the public assembly, and it could become binding. Forget to show up? That was your problem. Which leads us to a point of debate. Historians still argue whether these sheep ownership records were mostly informal, remembered by community consensus, or whether more systematic tracking methods were common, especially in wealthier settlements. Some suggest certain longhouses may have maintained detailed records, hidden away like ledgers. Others say it was all trust and tally sticks. The truth is probably somewhere in between. So, let's say a dispute arises. Someone claims your sheep is theirs. You stand in the sorting pen, wool between your boots and a whole village watching. You point to the ear notch. You point to the tag. You call your witnesses, maybe that old guy who can't hear, but remembers everything from the last 30 winters. If that fails, you escalate. Take it to the thing and let the assembly decide. And if you're really unlucky, it might escalate beyond words. Which brings us to our next truth. Sheep theft in Viking society wasn't just a nuisance. It was a scandal. An accusation of theft could damage your honor, your drengskaper, a word that meant more than just respect. It was your moral credit score, your inner worth. Lose that, and you might as well move out of the fjord. So you protect your sheep the way you'd guard your reputation, with diligence and memory, and occasionally, if you're feeling spicy, a very loud voice at the sorting pen. Here's a light joke to wind us back. You mark that you with a single notch? Yeah. What if someone else has the same? Well, I winked at it too, just to be safe. Ah, the old wink and notch method. Foolproof. As dawn finally pushes its golden fingers across the ridge, you do a final check. Your flock is accounted for. The notches are noted. The debts are squared, for now. There's soot on your fingertips from refreshing your stone marks. There's damp wool in your nose. And somewhere deep inside your head, 20 different voices are by and G in slightly judgmental unison. Ownership is complicated. But you've got your system. And more importantly, you've got your sheep. You're halfway through the grazing season now. The sheep are fatter. You're not. Your cloak smells like old lanolin and your boots have new holes. But the rhythm has settled in. The days are long. The sheep graze. You count. Again and again and again. And while your modern brain might start to scream, "Can't we get a break from all this math?" you're starting to understand something the Vikings knew intimately. Numbers weren't just tools. They were stories. And in the Norse world, stories mattered. Tonight, you're going to take a slow walk through a Viking's idea of arithmetic, if you can even call it that. Because they didn't use numbers like we do. They didn't write them down, didn't multiply with ease, didn't memorize times tables. But they understood value. They understood ratios. And most of all, they understood enough. Start here, the Vikings didn't have a digit 40. That's right, zilch for zilch. If there was nothing, they just didn't mention it. No placeholder. No symbol. Just absence. Which makes sense, in a society where space was filled with sky, water, or sheep, and no one needed to write 0 goats to know they had none. But here's the quirky twist, they still had a working system. You see, instead of digits, they leaned on words, spoken tallies, poetic rhythms, trade phrases. When they said a dozen, they often meant 12. But when they said a long dozen, that meant 13. That extra one was a Viking bonus. Call it the baker's dozen of the fjords. And don't even get started on the word jugugu. It meant 20. Clean. Crisp. Easy. But they'd also use hundra, which, bizarrely, sometimes meant 120 instead of 100. Yeah. 100 didn't always mean 100. Historians still argue whether this was just regional confusion or a deeper part of their duodecimal thinking, counting in 12s and scores instead of 10s. The result? You might trade 100 sheep and walk away with an awkwardly silent goat side-eyeing you because someone miscounted by 20. That leads us to ogtalfr, a term meaning in 12. It shows up in old trade contracts like a cryptic little wink. You owe me 100 ogtalfr. Which could be either 112 or 132 depending on whether your trading partner was from the western fjords or just bad at math. This is why Viking merchants often traveled with their own counter, not to haggle, but to translate. Now, how did this math meet the meadow? They counted sheep in groups, commonly 5s, 10s, 20s. Why? Because humans are better at remembering clusters than long strings. 5 sheep walk past, you whisper, 1 hand. 5 more, 2 hands. 20 sheep? That's a score. 2 score? You're practically an accountant. But, and this is important, you never just stared and counted aloud. That would have been silly. And suspicious. And what if someone interrupted you with a stray, "Hey, do you want stew later?" That's your count ruined. So, you used body mnemonics. Picture this, you hold your staff in your left hand. With each group of 5 sheep, you shift 1 finger on your right hand. Get to 5 fingers? You slide a knotted string 1 space down your wrist. You now have 2 built-in counters, 1 in flesh, 1 in thread. Some shepherds even used necklaces, moving a carved bead along a braided cord with each passing cluster. It was like wearable tech, minus the charging cable. One shepherd from the sagas, his name's lost to us, but his story lingers, was known for counting sheep by walking barefoot and curling his toes with every 10th animal. People thought he was just stretching. But no. That man was multitasking. History doesn't record how many splinters he got. Probably many. Now, here's your mainstream historical anchor. The use of base 12 and base 20 counting systems was common in many pre-modern cultures. The Vikings weren't alone. From the Babylonians to the Mayans, base 20 pops up again and again. Some say it's because we have 20 digits total, fingers and toes. Others think it's just easier to divide by 12 breaks into halves, thirds, quarters. Try doing that with 10 and you'll always have a leftover decimal frowning at you. Back to you, trudging across the moor. The clouds are low. You're counting again. 5, 10, 15. Og Talfer. You've made up a little rhyme to keep it flowing. Something about a ram with a crooked tail and a lamb who thinks she's a bird. It's nonsense, but it works. And as you count, you remember last spring, when you miscounted by 1 and swore there were 67 sheep, not 66. That one missing lamb turned up 2 days later in a neighbor's flock, completely unaware of the scandal it had caused. Its ear notch had faded. Its tail was cropped differently. Accusations flew. Voices rose. Ale was spilled. Which brings us to a truth the Vikings understood better than most: counting is never just counting. It's politics. It's memory. It's identity. Let's not forget, the Norse were oral storytellers. They recited entire sagas from memory, genealogies that stretched back 10 generations, lists of ships in a fleet, rosters of warriors lost at sea. Counting sheep? That was easy compared to keeping track of who killed whom at what fjord on which foggy Thursday. Here's a fringe tidbit for your woolly dreams: some shepherds carved secret marks into rocks along grazing paths. Just small scratches. 1 per 20 sheep. They looked like weathering or claw marks. But to the trained eye, they were mid-season checkpoints. Lose count in the fog? Just find your last scratch. You're back in business. So you count. And count. And at some point, you don't even notice you're counting anymore. It becomes rhythm. Like breath. Like heartbeat. The sheep shuffle by, and the world slows down. Until it doesn't. Because suddenly, the rhythm is off. 1, 2, 3, wait. Was that lamb there before? You start over. 5, 10, 12. Og Talfer. You don't know if you're counting sheep or mantras anymore. But you know it calms you. Which brings us to our closing light joke of the evening. Why do Viking shepherds never make mistakes? They do. They just argue about it until no one remembers what they were arguing about. Your night ends with a tally made of nothing but fingers, pebbles, breath, and confidence. You don't need 0. You don't need spreadsheets. You just need to feel the flock. And tonight, you do.